Good morning class. Today we are going to study chapter 3, that is an empire across 3 continents, class 11th history. Now in this chapter we are going to study about an empire which is spread across the 3 continents. Which are those 3 continents? The 3 continents are Europe, Asia and Africa. And the empire which is across these 3 continents, that is Europe, Asia and Africa, is the Roman Empire. First of all, we are going to talk about the sources which were found in the head of Roman Empire. Sources, there is a rich collection of sources to study Roman history. As I firstly said that we are going to study about Roman Empire, so there are many sources which are there for studying Roman history, like text, documents and material remains. Means we have some statues, we have some inscriptions, we have some documents regarding the Roman history. First we can see archaeological. Archaeological means we have studied about the excavations, the inscriptions, the statues. First is amphitheater, second amphorae, colosseum, statues and aqueducts. These are consisted in the archaeological sources, that are the statues, the colosseum, the amphitheater and the amphorae. Second type of sources which we find is the literary sources, which are written sources. Text, histories written by contemporary historians, means the ancient historians which have written histories about the Roman Empire regarding the text and the documents. Third, we have the aerial photographs. Aerial photographs means photography. Documentary sources include many inscriptions and papyri. Now in this aerial photographs, what sources are there? There are inscriptions also and there are papyri also. Now what is the meaning of papyri? Papyri means the papyrus was a reed-like plant that grew along the banks of the Nile in Egypt and was processed to produce a writing material that was very widely used in everyday life. Now this papyri, the inscription or the documentary of papyri has been come from a plant which is a reed-like plant, that is papyrus, and it is found along the banks of the Nile in Egypt, and it is processed in such a way that it can be used for a writing material that was very used at that time, at the time of Roman Empire. Inscriptions were usually cut in stone, so a large number survived in both Greek and Latin. Means they were written on stone so that they can live for a more time, or they can survive for a large number. In Greek also and in Latin. Which languages? In Greek and Latin one. Now papyrus was a reed-like plant that grew along the banks of the Nile in Egypt and was processed to produce a writing material that was very widely used in everyday life, means that is the inscription of papyri. Thousands of contracts, accounts, letters and official documents survive on papyrus. Now papyrus, I said that reed-like plant, so there are thousands of contracts, there are thousands of inscriptions and documents which are written on this papyrus and have been published by scholars who are called papyrologists. Now whatever inscriptions and whatever inscriptions, documents are written on this papyrus is studied by these are studied by the papyrologist. Now we come to the boundaries of Roman Empire. What countries or what things bounded the Roman Empire? The ancient Roman Empire, which was spread across the 3 continents, namely Europe, Asia and Africa. Previously also I said that this empire, the Roman Empire, was spread across the 3 continents, that was Europe, Asia and Africa. To the north, the boundaries of the empire were formed by 2 great rivers, Rhine and Danube. Means at the north side we had 2 rivers, the great rivers, that was Rhine and Danube. To the south, by the huge expanse of desert called the Sahara, and in the south section we had the Sahara desert. To the east, river Euphrates, and to the west Atlantic Ocean. Now east side we had Euphrates and in the west side we had the Atlantic Ocean. This vast stretch of territory was the Roman Empire. So all this, covering all these boundaries and spreading across the 3 continents, this was called the Roman Empire. That is why Roman Empire is called an empire across 3 continents. So as it got its name, that an empire across 3 continents, spreaded across Europe, Asia and Africa with its different boundaries. The Mediterranean Sea is called the heart of Rome's empire. Now, Roman Empire had main sea, that was the Mediterranean Sea, which was also called the heart of Rome Empire or the Roman Empire. Now, we studied about the boundaries, we studied about the sources which tell us about the Roman Empire. Now we come to the division of Roman Empire. What was the division of Roman Empire? First, the Roman Empire can broadly be divided into two phases, early and late, divided by the 3rd century as a sort of historical watershed between them. Now, Roman Empire was divided into two divisions. First was the early phase and second was the late phase. But here we had a watershed, a difference, a barrier between these two, the early and the late phase. That was the 3rd century. In other words, the whole period from the beginning of Roman Empire to the main part of the 3rd century means, in other words, the whole period from the beginning of means starting from the Roman Empire, starting from the beginning to the main part of the 3rd century can be called the early empire, means starting to the 3rd century was called as early empire, and the period from the 3rd century to the end called the late empire or late antiquity. Starting to the 3rd one was the early empire, and starting from 3rd century to the end was called as the late empire. And now we saw that there are two phases of Roman Empire, the early phase and the late phase. So we will study about the early empire. What was the early empire? What was the features of early empire? Now in early empire we are going to study one by one that how was the administration, how people were governed, how was the country being ruled. Secondly, we will see the army, the senate portion, the aristocracy, the emperor, republic, provincial territory and taxation. All these points we are going to study one by one in the early empire. Many languages were spoken in the empire, but for the officially Latin and Greek were the most widely used. Many languages were used in the Roman Empire, but the main languages was Latin and Greek. The regime established by Augustus, the first emperor in 27 BCE, was called the Principate, which means was leading citizen princeps. In Latin, not the absolute ruler. Now the Roman Empire, who was the first emperor? The first emperor of the regime, means of the Roman Empire, was Augustus, and he became the first emperor in 27 BCE. And what was he called? He was called Principate. Principate means a leading citizen, means the main leader, not the absolute ruler, but the main leader. He ruled till 14 BCE and brought to an end the chaotic condition prevailing in Roman Empire. He ruled till 14 BCE, starting from 27 BCE to 14 BCE he was ruling. But after that, some problems, some confusion, some chaos spread across the Roman Empire and his rule was vanished. The Principate was advised by the Senate, which had existed in Rome for centuries. Now what was the Senate? It was a group of people who advised the Principate. Principate means the main leader, not the absolute ruler but the main leader. He was advised by the Senate. It was a group of people who were advising them or who was advising the Principate in every rule. Means administration wise, how should the country be ruled, how should the taxation problems will be solved, everything, which had existed in Rome for centuries. This body, which had controlled Rome earlier in the days when it was a republic and remained a body representing the aristocracy, that is the wealthiest family of Roman and later Italian dynasties and many landowners. Now in the Senate part. This was a body which was controlling the Roman Empire for many years. But in this, what happened? There were a part of aristocracy, means representing aristocracy means the wealthiest family. Not the poor families, but the wealthiest families were forming a part of the Senate of Roman, and later on what happened that Italian descent many landowners, means only the wealthy families could be a part of Senate, not the poor families. Okay. Next to the emperor and the Senate, the other key institution of imperial rule was the army. First was the emperor, then we spoke about the Senate. Third portion here we come to the army, which was most important in the empire. Rome had professional conscripted army, which was forcibly recruited. Professional conscripted means by profession they were forced, and they were controlled like in such a way that they could not make any mistake. Okay, so they had professional conscripted army, and in this what was the problem, that they were forcibly recruited. They means they were forcibly forced to join the army. Military service was compulsory for certain groups or categories of the population for a minimum of 25 years. Means certain groups and certain people were forced to join the army for 25 years. It was fixed also, it was compulsory, it was forcibly. The emperor, the aristocracy and the army were the three main players in the political history of empire. Now the Roman Empire was standing on these three parts. First was the emperor, second was the aristocracy, third was the army. The success of individual emperors depended on the control of the army, and when the armies were divided, the result usually was civil war. Now what was the problem? That how can an emperor or individual emperor would be successful? Only if he had a natural control over his army, and if there was chaos or confusion or any kind of problem in the army, then it would lead to a civil war. Except for one notorious year when 4 emperors mounted the throne in quick succession. But there was a time period where 4 emperors one by one came into throne and they succeeded, and their emperor or their rule also succeeded. That was 69 CE. Now which are the emperors? We are talking about the emperor that was the first player of the Roman Empire. So here we have the emperors. First we have Nero, second Julius Caesar, third was Octavian Augustus, Tiberius and Trajan. These were the 5 rulers which were most important in the early phase of Roman Empire. Roman Empire made unprecedented growth in the light field of literature during Augustan age. Now when Augustus was the emperor of Roman Empire, what happened? Roman Empire grew in the field of literature. Means there was done a very much development in the field of literature part. Augustus played a significant role in expansion of Roman Empire. What he did, he spread the Roman Empire in such a way that a developed or successful Roman Empire could be stagnant. The Augustan age is remembered for the peace it ushered in after decades of internal strife. Means there was lot of problems, that of chaos and confusion. But after the decades of all this problem, the Augustan age, when the emperor was Augustus, what happened? It is remembered for peace. That at the time of Augustus, there was peace in the empire. And centuries of military conquest. Means before Augustus became the emperor, what happened? There was military conquest, there was military problems, army problems, there was internal strife also. But after Augustus came into rule, what happened? There was a peace ushered. Okay, peace was there in the Roman Empire. Augustus appointed Tiberius, his adopted son, as his successor, who ruled from 1403 CE. Now what happened? When Augustus thought, he appointed Tiberius. Tiberius was his adopted son, and he came into rule from 14 CE to CE. The empire he was already so vast that further expansion was felt to be unnecessary. The empire was so expanded in such a way, Augustus had expanded the empire in such a way that there was no necessity of expanding the rule very much. Trajan was a famous Roman emperor who ruled from 98 to 117 CE. So the next ruler we saw Augustus, then the Tiberius, and then was the Trajan, which was the famous Roman Empire who ruled from 98 to 117 CE. He made an immense contribution in expanding Roman Empire. Means at the time of Augustus, the empire was expanded, and in the time of Tiberius, there was no need to expand it. But what did Trajan do? He expanded the empire in such a way. The only major campaign of expansion in the early empire was Trajan's fruitless occupation of territory across the Euphrates in the years 113-17 CE, abandoned by his successors. Now what happened? That is, what was the campaign of expansion? What was the main reason of expansion? It was that the Trajan's fruitless occupation of territory. Fruitless occupation of territory means he wanted to expand the territories crossed the Euphrates in the years 113, which was then abandoned by his successor. So these were the rulers. Now we come to the territories. These were the rulers: Augustus, Tiberius, Trajan. Now we are talking about the territories. The Roman Empire had two types of territories. Now the early type of Roman Empire had two types of territories. First was dependent kingdoms and second were provincial territory. Dependent kingdoms means they were dependent on some or the other, okay, and provincial territories means they were independent. The Near East was full of dependent kingdoms, but they disappeared and were swallowed up by Rome. So the east portion was full of dependent kingdoms, but what happened? They disappeared and they come up with Rome. These kingdoms were exceedingly wealthy. For example, Herod's kingdom yielded 5.4 million denarii per year equal. Okay, so these kingdoms, which were the dependent kingdoms, they were wealthy. They had wealthy families. For example, we can say Herod's kingdom. Herod's kingdom yielded 5.4 million denarii. So it can be seen that it was a family, wealthy families, with 5.4 million denarii, which was equal to 125,000 kilogram of gold per year. So that was a time of Herod's kingdom. Okay, a city in the Roman Empire was an urban center with its own magistrates, city council, and a territory containing villages which were under its jurisdiction. So in Roman Empire, a city was there which was an urban center, means it had its own magistrates, its own courts, and city council territory which contained villages which were under its jurisdiction, means these all were controlled by the Roman Empire. Thus one city could not be in the territory of another city, but villages almost always were included. Means one city cannot be included in another city, but the villages, the smaller villages, were included in this part. The 3rd century crisis. Now we are going to talk about what were the crises, what were the problems which were in the 3rd century. We start that from the beginning to the 3rd was the early phase of Roman Empire. So the 3rd century crisis, the first 2 centuries were free from civil war. Okay, therefore it was known as a period of peace, prosperity and economic expansion. Means the 1st and the 2nd century were full of peace, prosperity and economic expansion. There was no problem. External warfare were also much less common in the first 2 centuries. Means apart from the civil war, apart from the Cold War, the war of words, apart from that, external warfare was also very less. But the 3rd century brought in the first sign of internal conflict. But in the 3rd century, what happened? There was a sign of internal conflict, which was a major one. From the 230s, the Roman Empire found itself fighting on several fronts simultaneously. From that part of 230s, what happened? The Roman Empire was fighting for smaller things, for all type of several fronts simultaneously. An aggressive dynasty called the Sasanians emerged in 225, which expanded rapidly just within 15 years in the direction of Euphrates. Now what happened? An aggressive kingdom, an aggressive dynasty, that was Sasanians, came into rule, emerged in 225, and it expanded over 15 years in the direction of Euphrates. Shapur I, the Iranian ruler, claimed he had crushed Roman army of 60,000 and even captured the eastern capital of Antioch. Now the Iranian ruler, what was the name? Shapur I. What he did, he claimed that he had crushed the army of Roman Empire of 60,000 and even captured the eastern capital. He had also occupied the capital of Antioch. Simultaneously, a whole series of Germanic tribes, or rather tribal confederacies, began to move against the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Now what happened? A whole series of German tribes, these German tribes were moving against the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and the entire period from 233 to 280 saw repeated invasions of a whole lot of provinces that stretched from the Black Sea to the Alps and the southern Germany. So this was the time period, that was 233 to 280, that was facing rapid invasions by many tribes. That were Iranian people, there were German tribes also, which were invading Roman Empire, and so it is known as the 3rd century crisis. The Romans were forced to abandon much of their territory beyond the Danube. Now, where Iranians, the German tribes, were occupying Rhine, Danube, so what was there? The Romans were forced to leave their territories over the part of Danube. There was a rapid succession of emperors in this century. 25 emperors in 47 years. Now, one by one the emperor was coming into rule. So, in 47 years there were 25 emperors. It's an obvious symptom of the strains faced by the empire in this period. So, in this 3rd century there was a rapid expansion of people who were invading Roman Empire for in such a the other way. But in 47 years 25 emperors came into rule, and what happened? It was a symptom that a 3rd century crisis had upcoming. Thank you.